Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about William Faulkner's poem entitled After 50 Years. Now this one is also a poem written during the modern period, so this is a modernist poet. When I look at the title, T for title, After 50 Years, I think about the number 50. I think about an extended period of time. I also think that maybe someone is looking back over a period of time and there's some sort of aging that is happening. Okay, so let's take a look at imagery. And the first image that I see is actually in line 3. And this one is blind bent fingers. And you can see what that may look like for this particular individual. And then the other imagery that I see is visual imagery, which is a bound heart. Oh my goodness, someone has been bound. Their heart is bound. So these are the two strong images that I found in the poem. You may find a few more images. Now let's take a look at the irony here. If you read this poem over several times, you see that this woman here, this object of the speaker's discussion here, and you can see her image, at some point in her life, she had men hovering over her like white birds. And so for me, I find it ironic for someone who looks in this way to have so many people seeking her affection. I find that rather odd. That's my example of irony. Let's take a look at P for paraphrase. Now, when we paraphrase this poem, if you can see, there are 14 lines, and I've actually divided this poem up into 4 sections. I've color-coded it, and I've paraphrased it, the first 3 sections in 4 lines each. Now, remember, if you feel like this poem is something that is super easy for you, then you can paraphrase it in 1 or 2 sentences, or if it's very dense or difficult, you may want to do it by line by line. In this case, I decided to do it this way because there's some distinctions in each of the 4 lines and then in the final 2. Remember, paraphrasing means that you are looking at the poem and telling literally what the poem is saying. So if we look at the yellow part, it really is describing an elderly woman alone in her room, or in her home, excuse me, and she's trying to weave something together, and whatever it is that she's trying to do is not holding. And then in the green highlight, it just simply discusses how this woman was once admired by many. And the blue section for the paraphrase mentions how others have dreamed of her. And then there's one in particular who was deeply in love with this woman. And the last 2 sort of indicates there's an issue where there's a man who is sort of fall victim to her and loves her desperately. Let's take a look at the speaker. Now, for me, when I see the speaker, I get the sense that it's an old man, someone who's really familiar with this woman, and whoever it is just simply not happy with her. He does not like her, or maybe he once did, but he certainly doesn't now. And so in the center here is who I identify as the speaker of the poem. Now I want to talk to you about the shift in the poem. And if you take a look here for me, there may be several shifts in the poem. You may recognize some other ones, but the one I want to focus on, a major shift for me, is this whole discussion or talk for the majority of the poem about this old woman. And we talk about, you know, her house is empty, her heart is old, there's deception, and her fingers are bent, and she's trying to, you know, put something together, and all these guys love her. And so there's this obsession, there's this discussion about this old woman. And then the last 4 lines of this poem, this guy out of nowhere, right, we get to see this victim. The point of view changes from her to his. And so I wanted to really, that drew my attention, and so I wanted to make sure I pointed that shift out to you. Some of you may see some other shifts, and you could tell in the way I paraphrased the poem in the previous slides, and the color coding, I've identified some other shifts. But to me, this is one of the major shifts in the poem. Now I want to take a look at the figurative language, and so for some of you this might be obvious, but not so obvious. And so we want to take a look at the first 2 lines and make a special note here that there's a metaphor, or metaphors actually, there's 2. Her house is empty. Whenever they have the is, that is really just like saying this is this, it's equal to this. The metaphor of the house is actually empty, it equates to that. Then we have her heart is old. Those two are considered metaphors in the poem, and so you could sort of, the two would be synonymous. The house, if you mention empty, that would be the house, and if you said the heart, the heart is old. So those are the two. You could almost say like it's imagery. For me, when I first saw it, I initially thought it was imagery, but remember, imagery is this big umbrella, and metaphor and simile sort of fall under the umbrella of an imagery. So they're very closely related. And then if we take a look, we'll see two similes that I identified in the poem, hovered like white birds. And so we're making this comparison of these men that are hovering over this woman like white birds. And hence I've put the image of what these white birds might look like. We see all these birds hovering over something, and I couldn't imagine all these men hovering over this woman for her caress. And then it says her presence like shed scent, which is sort of mentioning or alluding to this idea of this man towards the end, the last 4 lines of this poem, where they're discussing this man, and her presence was like shed scent, so maybe like he could smell her. But anyways, there is her presence, which is very much like this shed scent, so there is like this simile happening here. So again, for the figurative language, these are 2 that I've identified. You may have picked up something else as well. Let's take a look at the A for attitude. Now, in order to be able to identify what the attitude of a poem is, you need to know 1, who the speaker is, and 2, what the subject of the poem is. In this case, we're tying the 2 together here. We see this old man and we see this old woman, and his sentiments or his attitude towards her, I feel like, is one of disgust and negativity and disdain. So if I'm going to give you that tone, I certainly need to give you specific examples throughout the poem that might suggest that. So for me, the evidence might be an empty house. He's describing her old heart. There's some sort of deception. She clearly is incompetent because she can't even put things together. Some sort of reference to witch's gold. There's a bound heart, and then that snare that this man is victimizing, and not necessarily the speaker. So, and then look at the image that is sort of projected on us as an audience. This is the image we see. Clearly he doesn't like her. So for me, the attitude is negative and one of disdain, and it's almost as if his attitude is carrying over onto us as the reader, and so maybe, you know, we're adopting this same attitude towards this subject, which would be unfortunate. Okay, so let's take a look at the the S in Tips Fast. And we have sound, symbol, and sign of the times. And so if we take a look at the sound, and you guys all know my favorite part of poetry is the sound. So we have alliteration, H for house, heart is mentioned twice, hovered, and then we have B for blind, which is also mentioned twice, bent, mentioned twice, bind, birds, and then we have S for save, still, sweet, softness, stood, soft, scent, and snare. Now I'm sure you can see the contrast not only in the way I'm writing it, but in the connotations that's associated with the words beginning with the letter S. And then we have the rhyme scheme A, B, B, A, and then we have A, C, C, A, and then we have D, E, D, E, and then the last 2 lines, which is a E and a D. We have the meter as iambic pentameter. Of course, we know the 10 syllables and the unstressed versus the stress. And for assonance, we have the sound, the letter A, sound in shay and save, minor assonance, and then we have the O in old, echoes, no, hold, rose, told, gold, no, and rose. And then we have the sound in caress, tress, it should say witches, witnesses, softness, and presets, okay? And then, so that's more assonance in the poem, and if you really pronounce those, then you'll hear that sound. Also, we have symbol. I couldn't figure out what the symbol was in the poem, and then I looked through, and then the heart may be the symbol, and it's line 1 and 12. Heart is mentioned twice. It's at least at the beginning and somewhere towards the end. Usually you like to have it in the beginning, middle, and end in some form, but obviously heart is important. Someone's heart is crushed or in some form. And then we have the sign of the time, and you can tell by the description of the speaker and the way he describes this old woman, very straightforward. There's no holding back. Telling it like it is, just like the modernists do in their works. So we're going to take a look at the last part of the tips fast, which is T, and it actually stands for title and theme. And so that should say title. And so now if I re-evaluate this poem after everything that I've discovered and observed in the poem, for me now, if I look at the title that says after 50 years, it represents like time. And the speaker possibly knows the woman. These are sentiments that after 50 years of knowing you, he has grown to hate this woman. This is my thoughts now after everything. And the theme, for me is beauty fades over time. So once this woman was beautiful and she is no longer very attractive, inside or out.